The Gospel of Luke opens with the announcement of a birth, but not the announcement of the birth of Jesus, but the announcement of the birth of John the Baptist. While there's a close link between the two characters in all of the synoptic Gospels that you can't have helped but have noticed up to this point as you work through the course materials, in Luke's Gospel they're presented as cousins. Zechariah, who is a righteous priest of old age, is given the once-in-a-lifetime honor of being able to offer the incense to God at the time of prayer. So he is literally, through the burning of the incense, sending up the prayers of the people of Israel at the time of the afternoon prayer and sacrifice. And this priest, who more than anybody should have believed that God can do anything, is encountered by a heavenly visitor who says, you're going to have a son, you're going to name him John, which is emblematic of God's salvation, God's good gifts. And he doesn't believe. He says, I'm too old, my wife is too old, there's no way this could happen. And he's stricken mute until these events come to pass. After this, there's another announcement. Now, of course, the wife, though, Elizabeth, she believes. So there's an emblematic of, the man who's the religious leader kind of fails to comprehend that God really can't act in history. But Elizabeth, his simple wife, believes. The next visitation we have is very different than the gospel narration in the Gospel of Matthew, which really all the action in Matthew centers around Joseph. In Luke's Gospel, all of the action centers around Mary, who is presented as a very young woman who is living in the town of Nazareth where Jesus grew up later on, and she is simply just chosen. And in Luke's Gospel, it's not uncommon in the ancient world for there to be stories of divinities seducing or being with young women, producing children by them. If you're familiar with the Greek myths of Hercules, for example, his mother was a woman that Zeus seduced and had sex with and produced him, and he's sort of both God and human. He's a demigod. He has remarkable power. This is very different than the account we have here in Luke's Gospel. There's no sexual overtones to the encounter between God and Mary. There's just simple submissiveness on her part. Whatever it is that his will is, that's fine. His power overshadows her and it comes to happen. So Luke is very, very clear, even more so than Matthew, that this is a virgin birth, that this is a miraculous conception that does not involve a human father. While Matthew deals with that in short order, Luke goes into a great deal more detail to portray Jesus' birth as being entirely miraculous and without the normal use of a human father in this process. Mary's faith is remarkable. As a young girl awaiting her marriage, she probably would have been, 14 years old at the most, waiting on the time where she would be married to her betrothed husband, who was probably a lot older than her and was chosen by her parents as a good match for her. She's waiting on that to happen as just an ordinary girl in a backwater town who probably just wanted to raise her kids and make it in this tiny hamlet of a village, trying to be as good a person as she could. And yet this ordinary person is singled out to be the person who God wants to use to bring his hope into the world, to be the mother of his son. There's something very important in Luke and in Matthew about Jesus's parents and his upbringing, that they're very ordinary people. They're even poor people who were acquainted with struggle, people who were on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, who had to work very hard for the life that they had. And yet these are the people that God chooses, and their faith is remarkable. Mary goes to see Elizabeth, who is her cousin, who is pregnant with John, even though she's far too old to be pregnant. When Mary goes to greet Elizabeth, you'll notice in the text that the child in Elizabeth's womb leaps for joy, and Elizabeth just kind of knows what's going on. And there's this joy between the two mothers, and they sing this song. Mary's song, the Magnificat, is this remarkably subversive text, and sometimes we miss how important this text is, and really also how subversive. To read to you from the New Living Translation, she says, "My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior. He took notice of a lowly servant, and from now on all generations will call me blessed. For the Mighty One is holy, and he has done great things for me. He shows mercy from generation to generation on all who fear him. His mighty arm has done tremendous things. He has scattered the proud and the haughty. He has brought down princes from their thrones and exalted the humble. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away with empty hands. He has helped his servant Israel and remembered to be merciful. He has made his promise to our ancestors, to Abraham and his children forever." And Mary remains there until shortly the time before John's birth. we sometimes miss the subversiveness of that text. And it's just lovely words, exuberant words from a teenager who's happy to be playing this part in God's story in the world. What Mary sings there is replete with Old Testament quotations and ideas, and also a major theological theme that will show up again and again in the Gospel of Luke. And that is the idea of the great reversal, as what some theologians have called it. Again and again in Luke, the people who seem to be blessed, the people we would assume to be, hashtag blessed, fortunate because they're rich, they're powerful, they're well, are often the people who are in disfavor with God because of their neglect of the poor, the oppressed, the orphan, the widow, the outsider, the Gentile world. And God is up to something in changing all of those expectations. That's really important to Luke's interpretive approach and his presentation of Jesus. In the way that Luke teaches us to interpret the Old Testament scriptures and in the way it presents Jesus, yes, Jesus is a very Jewish Messiah, but one that we understand very differently and that reverses a lot of the traditional expectations of who the Messiah will be, what he will do, and the purpose and nature of his work. Mary hints at that even here, that instead of him being born in a kingly family, he's born in a humble family, and God is changing the estate of the lowly and the poor and the desperately low in life and exalting them and showing them a special outpouring of his favor. So Mary is a person of remarkable faith, and we encounter her most closely here. There's a curious thing that we continue to run into in these chapters as angels say things to Mary or people say things to Mary, where she keeps these things and ponders them in her heart. And that is uniquely a feature of the Gospel of Luke. Some early writers dealing with that suggested that maybe Luke knew Mary and talked to her herself. We don't know that to be the case, but he certainly pays a special attention to her and this ongoing reflection inside of her about who her son is and the significance of what God is doing and has drawn her and Joseph in to be a part of. In Luke's presentation of the birth of Jesus, there is something that's interesting, and we'll talk about that in the next section as it's a time clue for the writing of the gospel. In particular, Luke gives us a date. Matthew situates the birth of Jesus during the reign of Herod the Great. So we know Herod the Great died in 4 BC, so Jesus is born before that, probably in 7 or 6 BC or BCE, depending on which one of those you use. Luke gives us another time clue. He tells us that Caesar Augustus, who we would think of as Octavian, we know him certainly as Caesar Augustus, he is the first true Roman emperor. Julius Caesar breaks with Roman tradition. He marches his own armies across the sacred river there in Rome, and he declares himself dictator for life and of course assassinated. Something of a civil war ensues, and at the end of that, after defeating Cleopatra and Mark Antony, Octavian becomes Caesar Augustus. So Augustus means holy or revered. It had previously only been used of the Romans toward their gods, and yet now it's invested in a person, and he is the first true Roman emperor who didn't have to win that title. His uncle Julius Caesar, of whom he was the heir, sort of set that standard, and he began the emperor at about that time. So we know it's during his long and very peaceful reign, and we also know that it's during the reign of Herod the Great, shortly before his death. Luke gives us another time clue, and he talks about the practice of census taking. Because Rome was building empires, it was not uncommon for them to have regional censuses taken where people would go register so they know what the population is, and they can also pay their poll taxes and things of that nature. Now, Luke presents this as if it's a universal census throughout all the world, and sometimes many people have interpreted that way. What is much more likely is that this is a regional census that's being taken for people within given regions, particularly within the regions of the Jews, within the domain of Herod the Great. This is a regional census, but the practice of engaging in periodic regional census was established under Caesar Augustus. So that probably explains what Luke is getting at there. We do know from about AD 120, it's not uncommon for people to have to report to an ancestral hometown. There is a case in Egypt that's pretty well known where people had to report to an ancestral hometown to complete this process. So it's not outlandish to suggest that Joseph, at least, and Mary, who wanted to go with him, would have to report to their ancestral hometown there in Bethlehem to complete this process. That may have been where their genealogical records were housed. That may have been the district assigned. We don't know all of that. Certainly it serves to fulfill Old Testament prophecy. So there's a whole host of things that Luke is driving at with that. Luke gives us another time clue, and this is a major point of contention for many scholars about the accuracy of the New Testament. He says this taxing, this census, was first made when Quirinius was the governor of Syria. Now, Quirinius is somebody that we know was governor of Syria in around AD 13. He was officially made that post. So is Luke off on his chronology, or is Matthew off? How do we know? It is possible, though, that rather than meaning the governor proper, we do know that Quirinius was assigned to Syria during I think around 12 BC down to around 6 BC, because he was serving there essentially as the military governor of the region. While there was a different civil governor, he was there on special assignment, providing military leadership and putting down a rebellion. So that could be why Luke uses a curious phrase when he was first governor of Syria instead of his later official appointment. That's a point of contention between scholars, and it's something that you're certainly going to come up against if you do some research on this at some point in your life. But just know that Quirinius did serve in Syria twice and in two kind of distinct roles, once as sort of a military leader and military governor, regional general, and another time as the official Roman governor or procurator of that province. So Luke does give us some time clues. If we are to understand that, as his first being appointed as the military governor of the region, this process in the story of Jesus' birth lines up pretty well with the Gospel of Matthew and puts us somewhere around 7 to 6 BC for the birth of Jesus, when the events in here begin to take place.